I teach at Stanford University. I would like to acknowledge that Stanford University sits on the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. Together with Stefania, and supported by Stanford Global Studies, I'm hosting this seminar series called Reframing Enslaved Pasts. We are planning 6 seminars, and provisionally we're hoping that in 2 weeks we will have a seminar led by Professor Johan Fourie of Stellenbosch University. That will be announced in due course. Why are we doing this? Well, big data approaches to the study of enslavement already boast many digital projects and websites. Among these, the Atlantic world predominates by far, with other regions such as the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean still relatively neglected. The goal of our series is to bring well-established projects into contact with newer ones. Presenters have been asked to address the following questions. What are the scholarly goals and opportunities driving your research project? What are the affordances and challenges involved in your chosen approach or approaches? How would you characterize your use of databases? With these questions, we aim to facilitate a discussion about critical data practices around enslaved pasts, focusing on methodologies. In the interest of full disclosure, I should say that several of us in this Zoom have been involved in projects around the Indian Ocean labor diaspora. Speaking for myself, in particular, Nigel Worden, Joe Groenewald, Laura Mitchell, Kerry Ward, Paul Weinberg, Stefania, and I have been involved in interrelated projects focusing on the Cape of Good Hope in the 17th through mid-19th centuries. More about that in due course. This seminar series is funded by Stanford Global Studies, which aims to archive the talks on its YouTube channel, as Stefania mentioned. So we hope that's okay with you. The series brings together 2 recent initiatives. One, the Aftermaths of Slavery workshop, which James Campbell and I ran for several years, supported by the Center for the Comparative Study of Race and Ethnicity, and the Critical Data Practices workshop of CESTA, the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. We hope that this series will engage not only scholars, but also heritage practitioners working on histories and archaeologies of enslavement and other kinds of labor diaspora, and especially those pursuing comparative studies of the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, and other systems, those committed to public-facing humanities, those interested in digital humanities and critical data practices. Given technological innovations of recent times, there is much to gain from trans-regional discussion between well-known and emerging projects. We also seek to compare big data projects with more humanistically based ones. Today, we are delighted that Professor Rose Boswell and our own colleague, Professor Krish Seetah, are joining us to start our series. Stefania will introduce the speakers. So over to you, Stefania. Thank you very much.
You're muted.
Thank you, Krish. I was speaking for myself. Hello again. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, Professor Rose Boswell. Professor Rose Boswell is an anthropologist and poet affiliated with Ocean Sciences Campus, Nelson Mandela University, South Africa. She is also a DSI NRF South African Research Chair in Ocean Cultures and Heritage. She's the author of several volumes, of which Le Malaise's Creole Ethnic Identity in Mauritius, Representing Heritage in Zanzibar and Madagascar, challenges to identifying and managing intangible cultural heritage in Mauritius, Zanzibar, and Seychelles, post-colonial Africa anthropologies, things left unsaid, and pandemics. Now she's currently co-editing the Palgrave Handbook on Blue Heritage, due to be published in 2022. Professor Boswell is going to talk to us about disseminating, popularizing, accessorizing intangible cultural heritage in Southern Africa and in the Ocean region. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rose Boswell.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefania, and thank you to Stanford for inviting me to this important set of global workshops on a variety of issues, including big data. So my contribution today, this evening in South Africa, as Stefania has indicated, will be focused on the dissemination, the popularizing, and what I call the texturizing of intangible cultural heritage, or ICH, in Southern Africa and in the Southwest Indian Ocean. And I will start very briefly by stating that I have been conducting mostly face-to-face, or what is known as in situ research, anthropological research in the Southwest IOR since 1999. So it's been quite a few years. Although for some, this may not seem to be very long ago, I think that certainly at that point in time, the internet was not readily accessible or available to all scholars, or even those who are in the general community who wanted to access this information. And indeed, as I write here, I think there are still universities in Southern Africa, at least, that have poor access to the internet and secondary data that is available to scholars, in our part of the world is often quite old and potentially outdated. And it's not the case. It's not uniformly the case across Southern Africa. We have fairly good digital internet library services and so on. So there are some institutions that have consistent access to this information, but it's not the case for everyone. So if you will permit me, I will just very briefly share my screen. So at least you have some visuals other than me, and we will be able to quickly proceed through the presentation. Right, okay, you can see this. So just a quick overview of some approaches to intangible cultural heritage in the Indian Ocean region. And I think it's clear to many people who are working in this area or have worked in this area that heritage conservation and knowledge acquisition and dissemination in the region has been mostly through non-governmental organizations, the existing UNESCO commissions, the national legislation that is available for the protection of heritage via the presentation of what's called tangible heritage. So intangible cultural heritage itself, which is the folklore, oratory, poetry, and so on, has not really featured in the practices and the interest and the focus of national governments in our part of the world. However, and as the research has shown over the years, community transmission of ICH is taking place all the time and is in culturally influenced contexts. I mean, we can see it in the sailing traditions of local communities, in their boat making traditions, fishing approaches, or to ideas and beliefs about the ocean, in land cultivation, music making, and fashion. And it's not just my work, but the work of a number of historians and other anthropologists that have contributed to this rich archive of knowledge. We also see that through the current popularization of the media, especially social media, that this is providing yet another influential space for culture sharing. And so when we tend to think specifically about big data, our thinking is that we have these massive, to my mind, at least being an anthropologist, these really significant or substantive data sources that then can allow for sort of, really intensive cross-comparative work in fields such as, like, the aftermath of slavery, which is a theme that was raised by Grant earlier on. But if we look, if we use the ethnographic method, the face-to-face in situ approach to field research, which is often doesn't yield that possibility for doing quick comparisons, we see that in fact there is a lot of sharing of knowledge that is happening even at the local community level. And it's a pity, that this information is somehow not being captured in a way that can be used for other potential comparative purposes. And so in order to attend to this and to try and reach what I call a form of comparative analysis, my field research has been multi-sited, which is a term that was introduced by George Marcus as early as 1995, in which he talks about the importance of anthropology not being confined to specific, imaginary exotic locales, and the fact that what one has to do this comparative work in order to reach beyond the imagined national boundaries in order to understand what is going on in terms of cultural heritage and its conservation in different countries. So in essence, as you can see from the map on the right side of your screen, my fieldwork then spanned Mauritius, where it started in the early sort of 1997, 98, right through to work in Madagascar at the time of there was a political coup in Madagascar in 2009. So I was there doing field research at the time, and then also in Zanzibar, and very briefly in Seychelles in the mid 2000s. And I've been continuing this comparative work in the Southern African context because I feel that it's important to gain sort of not just a depth or in-depth understanding of what's going on in the local community in order to understand the intangible cultural heritage expressions in that community, but to see what potential comparative possibilities there are across different countries. So my current work, which as Stefania mentioned, is under this project for the research chair in ocean cultures and heritage. And to answer the question put by Grant earlier on about the scholarly goals of the work, primary goal of the work is to research, explore, investigate, document, and advance national and global knowledge of ocean cultures and heritage in South Africa and selected regions of the world. In the African context, for those who are not familiar with the continent, in the African context, the work is pursuing the understanding of intangible cultural heritage in Namibia, specifically the areas of Swakopmund and Walfish Bay. There are some indigenous communities in these areas that have been expressing the intangible cultural heritage for many, many years, and it's not entirely well documented. In Kenya, specifically Lamu Island, where there's massive port development that is taking place, and this is impacting on millennia-old traditions, some of which come from the Middle East. Mozambique, for Carla, who's there, that's why I asked what work she's doing. Mozambique and Maputo, where we have PhDs and independent researchers that are looking at coastal cultural heritages in the Mozambican context, as well as South Africa, and of course, Zanzibar, Tanzania, where the work is continuing and is being deepened. So here you can see the sites and also some of the topics that we're looking at. Heritage is obviously a key one, but there are also what I would call subsidiary topics of tourism and poverty, or related topics of tourism, poverty, issues of sustainable development, especially as it relates to ocean management in these spaces, as well as the impact of environmental change. So quite a few things that are going on. And how are we disseminating this information? Interestingly, the approach is allowing us to answer Grant's second question around the affordances that are being offered by this particular approach of in situ ethnographic work. It is allowing for film, for example. We have a few specialists on our team that are filmmakers, and they are helping us with the production of documentary films on intangible cultural heritage in the chosen locales. Poetry is another area that I've chosen personally because I feel that it allows for a mostly unacademic, I suppose, approach. I call it the unacademic approach to ethnography, because instead of doing fairly detailed work over a long period of time, poetry gives you the opportunity to work with data in a way that is completely innovative and also potentially instantaneous. So there's a bit of circulation of thinking, recirculation of thinking that's happening between the poetry and the formal academic outputs. Then there's also the practical government-oriented work, policy briefs, for example, op-eds that I'm trying to get out in order to share the knowledge in a more public format, webinars, and of course the more traditional academic papers, chapters, and hopefully books. So for me personally, the challenge has been that I work in a very transdisciplinary environment. And because I work in a very transdisciplinary environment, I work mostly with marine spatial planners and marine biologists, and they are au fait, as they say in the Indian Ocean region. They are used to working with big data in ocean research. So a lot of comparative work in fisheries, in marine spatial planning, in social ecological studies of ecosystems, and the sustainability of these systems. And these individuals who are based in the natural sciences are very much, as I said, they are used to working with big data in ocean research. And on the other side, I also work with historians, and the historians, as Krish will know through his archaeological work, the historians are also, more comfortable with working with big data. And this is really critical because, I mean, if you look at this particular article that's situated on the slide about the Western Indian Ocean having declared many hundred thousands of square miles of ocean being declared as marine protected areas, I think this is critical when you think of the place of culture in the story, because there are no culture protected or cultural spatial areas, protected areas, other than that which is afforded by UNESCO through the World Heritage Sites. Nevertheless, just a quick look at what UNESCO itself is doing. You can see that UNESCO is already using big data in a really phenomenal way. For example, this is just a snapshot of this project which they have called Dive into Intangible Cultural Heritage, and they've done it on a global basis. So it allows you to click on any one of those bubbles that you see on the screen there, and it'll take you through a series of what looks like neural networks to a range of different possibilities, showing you how these particular cultural expressions are in fact manifesting in different societies across the world. And for me, it would be very interesting if we had something similar for the Indian Ocean region, or potentially for Africa, because we don't have that for Africa. In fact, if you look at the conservation of intangible cultural heritage in Africa, I don't have that on my notes here, but the protection of intangible cultural heritage in Africa, the continent of Africa, is in fact quite dire. The focus of national governments has been mostly on tangible heritage, sites, monuments, artifacts. And even then, from my knowledge, and this may be limited, but from my knowledge, we don't have an archive of sorts or a big data sort of repository, an online repository, other than that which UNESCO offers us, to be able to look at how, what data is out there and how to compare this. But the UNESCO site is actually quite interesting because there are possibilities for digging deep, in these sites and looking for specific information, whether you're looking at national legislation regarding intangible cultural heritage and its protection, or whether you're looking for data regarding, heritage sites in danger. So what has been the challenge? Just to answer that second question regarding the challenges. Well, I think the traditional research values play a really big role in anthropology. A lot of attention is given to the significance of, in situ, face-to-face research, even though there are quite a few anthropologists now who are, I would say, interested in the possibilities that big data can afford. And this very brief paper by Justin Lane, which is available online, tells us quite, in quite a straight way, just how, in fact, there are concerns regarding data collection in the new research context. Really, a lot of the issues revolve around the problem of anonymity. because you have this whole process of informed consent, where, you know, if you do in-situ and face-to-face research, you obtain the trust of your participants, you potentially have access to fairly intimate details about their family life and their community situation. And so if that information had to be put into a database, into a repository, unless it was fully sanitized, you know, where the specific details are actually removed, you could potentially compromise the anonymity of these individuals and therefore put them at risks, you know, of all sorts of things, especially when you're doing potentially contentious research. And I'll give one quick example. Obviously, it didn't apply at the time, but in the late 1990s through to about 2015, when I was doing field research on and off, you know, in Mauritius and also in various parts of the Indian Ocean region, some of the work was actually politically contentious. So it would speak to instances where there was, you know, nepotism by the government and the way in which people had been discriminated against when they, you know, went in search of employment, or perhaps they had, you know, they were in dire circumstances where they were living in terribly impoverished conditions, where they had resorted to, you know, drug use or substance abuse. And so the difficulty there is that obviously the data that is collected, one is very careful as to how one shares that information and the extent to which one shares that information, how one shares that information. What would happen, for example, in a case where you have a repository and that information, you know, aspects of that information could be shared more widely, or there's an imperative to actually share that information more widely. So it's a little bit difficult in the anthropological context. So as they say here, sometimes the modern digital environment is one where researchers have access to individuals' data, sometimes deeply personal data, at the touch of the button, and participant anonymity then becomes a thorny problem. Just to quickly move on, I'm aware of time. So another challenge, I think, is that the work that I've been doing for the last, I would say, couple of decades now also shows, in fact, that human life is a profoundly sensorial affair. So it's a texturized experience that we go through our existence as the sensory researchers, you know, would say, you know, experiencing all of our senses, touch, sight, scent, you know, pressure, all of these things we experience as living entities. And in fact, that information comes through quite strongly in the ethnography and has been a strong point of the ethnography. And I give you two images here, one from Southern Africa of the healer diviner who relies on his ability to connect with individuals in the world beyond the dead, with the ancestors. And that information is then conveyed through detailed ethnographic work. And of course, it's useful. I think it's valuable information which can be shared with broader global society. I would be fascinated to know if there are possibilities for comparative work in this regard, because, you know, I can go into sort of different databases and I can look at what is happening in Brazil, or I can see what's happening in China insofar as traditional healing is concerned, belief in the afterlife. But it would be amazing to have the opportunity to be able to compare this information, to compare the data and to look at similarities and to plumb the data for various other insights. Similarly, with the work, that's an image from Madagascar, fieldwork specifically in the northern part of Madagascar, the role of sensory heritage, how women, how gender, for example, plays a very important role in the shaping, the sensory aspects play a very important role in shaping gender relations in the Indian Ocean region. Women are often, you know, they don't really form part of, you know, research projects dealing with ICH, because national government's only interested, for the most part, in tangible heritage sites and monuments and so on. So for me, it would be interesting to know whether similar possibilities for comparison exist elsewhere. So this is a major challenge of the ethnographic approach. It provides you with that, often with that narrow, deep insight into the work, but it doesn't give you the opportunity often to do that kind of broad comparative work which you would like to do. So coming to an end, so this is just an example of the sensorial world and how the ethnography was pulled in. That detailed kind of in-depth kind of work around the role of scent, for example, in Zanzibar, and how that, ironically, how that produced an entire sort of epistemological foundation, knowledge foundation, that allow people to communicate with one another, not through the visual as tends to happen in a more westernized context, but through scent alone, because people, for the most part, in this largely Islamic society, people for the most part are largely covered. So my question is, I mean, don't look at the publications below, that's just for interest. My question is, could we do I think for me, an interesting question is ethnographic work almost like slow data, just like slow food is, is it a slow data? And do you have, if you think of slow food, then is slow data, do you have like what in the Indian Ocean region we would call a terroir? Do you have a terroir for research? So that each area that you come across produces these really unique situations or insights, completely, potentially incommensurable, data sets that are very difficult to incorporate into sort of the big data approach. How do we incorporate this? If the sense is important, how does one then translate that into a largely still paperized and digitized form of communication? Yeah, so this is the conclusion of the discussion. I think in the little notes that I had here, I mentioned, I made a comment about a very old piece by Michel Foucault and his Archaeology of Knowledge, in which he talks about the importance of excavating knowledge. And I think big data is massively useful. And I would love to be able to see how we could, comparatively do some of the work, across different settings in the Indian Ocean region. I'd be fascinated to see how that could be done. But I still think there is value in that slow data. I still think there's value in the institute research. The only challenge is that it does take a lot of time. It does take focused attention, but I suppose in the end, it yields a data that is usable in other ways. So yes, so let me end there. I'll stop share, and thank you, Stefania and colleagues, and I look forward to questions. And these are just some of the people on the team. We have quite a big team, it's growing, but there are people from South Africa, from Mozambique, and from all over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. Thank you. Please, everyone, keep your question for at the end of Krish's presentation. So now I'd like to move on and introduce the next speaker, Professor Krish Seetah. Professor Krish Seetah is an environmental archaeologist specializing into archaeology. He's an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology here at Stanford, with an educational background in biology and health studies and ecology. His research integrates archaeological, historical, anthropological, and climate science data and approaches. Since 2008, he has directed the Mauritian Archaeology and Heritage MAC project, which focuses on bringing the unique and rich archaeological past of Mauritius to a wide audience. MAC engaged with a scientific approach to historical archaeology, and this is exemplified in his presentation today, which present a new result based on biomolecular analysis of artifacts associated with the laboring peoples brought to Mauritius during the colonial period. This result shed important light on the agency of the laboring classes and how they governed specific aspects of their well-being. Professor Sita is also a fellow of Center for Innovation Global Health a fellow and awardee of a Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Center and senior fellow of Wood Institute. Professor Seetah is going to talk to us about studying labyrinth life waves can be a pathway to policy intervention, archives and epidemics in the ocean world. Please join me in welcoming Professor Krish Seetah.
Thank you very much. I just very briefly thank you, Grant and Stefania, for organizing this workshop. I've been slightly involved in the Aftermath of Slavery series, which I thought was brilliant, and I hope that this can have the same kind of resonance. I am really honored to sort of share the stage, shall we say, with Rose Boswell. It's such a pleasure. I've sort of tried to engage Professor Boswell's work for many years, and it was part of the lead into my work in Mauritius anyway. And I have to acknowledge that Professor Monica Green is in the Zoom room, and somebody whose work again has really influenced me within the context of disease. So I'll do the same. I'll quickly share a screen. I know that we're a bit short of time, so I'll probably plow through this a bit quickly. Can you see my screen? And let me do that. And I hope you can see the screen there. Okay, for some reason, part of this has been cut off. Okay, so I sort of pick up on some of the elements that have been touched on. I think that it's important that I lay out from the beginning that my approach and my desire to sort of increase our understanding of enslavement also means looking at the broader context of laboring peoples around the world. I think Grant has been quite unapologetic about the fact that many people's work on this call and who are being who are discussing today their own work is focused on the Indian Ocean world. So we need to look beyond the Atlantic experience. And for this talk, I also want us to consider the relationships between enslavement and indenture, how the different groups may have interacted and ultimately formed and worked together to create new communities around the world. I was just sort of serendipitous, but when I had was given insight into Professor Boswell's talk, I was really pleased that in fact, there's a lead in with ICH, Intangible Heritage, and my work here and the work of my colleagues. So it's not my work, our work here is very much towards tangible evidence and heritage. But I will stress what I'm going to present to you today is preliminary. There's many other elements of this project that are more developed, but I'm just going to focus on relatively new results that have come out in the last few weeks that have really given us an opportunity to say perhaps some of this work can have policy implications in the future, particularly because of how it can help us deepen understanding of the context from which we are drawing our evidence from. So this is not a typical anthropological to archaeological approach. I'm aiming very much to be applied with the work that I do and the work of our team. And we work with a large group of colleagues, including industry partners in the AI field. As Stefania mentioned, I'm a fellow of various centers, but I just want to acknowledge that the funding has come from for this work that I'll present today has come from the Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Center, Stanford Archaeology Center too. And I want to sort of respond immediately to Grant's first question is, what are the scholarly goals and opportunities driving the research? Well, I'm going to focus specifically on a topical subject, epidemic disease, and how we can use new data science tools, this revolution in digitization and the kind of broader context of big data, alongside other lines of evidence to help us better understand the impacts of disease on laboring peoples and potentially see how policy implications for contemporary populations can be derived from those. So those are kind of the scholarly goals I aim for. And those populations today who are dealing with climate damage. And in that context, that damage is often rooted in colonial practice. So I hope that lays out what's driving our research and our project specifically. As I mentioned, this is part of a larger project titled Adaptive Reflexive Modeling Arm Against Malaria, where we seek to use 300 years of past data to try to predict what diseases like malaria, but also other vector-borne diseases, how they're going to interact with the environment over the course of the next 50 plus years. I just very quickly provide a little bit of background to Mauritius. We have a context of 3 periods of colonial European hegemony, culminating with the British from about 1810, where we saw the great experiment. So the experiment to replace enslaved labor with indentured contract labor actually took place on Mauritius, and it led to a very rapid demographic change. It's been described as one of the most rapid demographic transformations seen in the region, according to a senior colleague of ours, Ned Alpers, where basically we go from about 90,000 people who are predominantly of African descent to over 400,000+ people, predominantly of South Asian, Indian descent, in a relatively short period of time, a few decades. So that's really one of the contextual aspects I want you to keep in mind. The other is ecology, really rapid ecological change from about 98% forested territory to about 2%. So those two parameters coming together, I don't need to labor this point. We're all aware of why population flux and demographic changes, as well as ecological changes, lead to epidemic disease. But in Mauritius, the scale of epidemic disease was massive. In 1867, the example here, about 10% of the entire population was wiped out by a malaria epidemic. So it was thought. I just want to mention that this was before Roland Ross's work, which came just a few years afterwards, or a few decades, talking about 1901. Roland Ross undertakes this really important study on malaria in India, uncovers the main etiology of the disease. And as a matter of fact, the first major study that he takes is in Mauritius because the malaria context was so prominent. So I just want you to remember malaria, the bad air ideology that underpinned understanding the miasma understanding of malaria and vector-borne diseases at that time was still in play. So we don't have absolute accuracy, and that's one of the things that we're trying to disentangle and understand from modern contemporary techniques using genomics and so on. So I just want to point very quickly to some of the data sets that we're drawing together. We've got very good some archival resources in the form of maps from some of the cemetery sites that we're actually working on. This is a map from the site of Bois Marchand, which was actually established specifically to deal with that epidemic from 1867. It was the largest cemetery in the Indian Ocean world when it was established in 1868, and the 3rd largest in the world. So that gives you some indication of the extent to which political and social and economic transformations were being galvanized because of the impact of epidemic disease. It wasn't just the scale, but it was a particular detrimental impact to laboring populations that caused some of the transitions that we saw, why we're starting to see these changes. And in fact, the transformations in population likely were causal to some of the epidemics themselves. It's just a point in note from the historical records, there are no indications of malaria. So just to be clear, this is history recording this, and we obviously need to have other data sources to sort of support or refute the questions, but there were no indications of malaria during the French period. So prior to about 1810, we have no indications of malaria historically recorded. And from about 1855, we start to see epidemics develop, and these are recorded in history and a really important source of evidence for us. And as I sort of summarize here, we've got the extent, the kind of endpoint of that when it really galvanizes massive local changes, including in quarantine, et cetera, is from about 1867, 68. And that was sort of a milestone that was really transformative. And in all of these general, what I want you to be clear about, I hope that you can see, we can actually see indications of Hindu. So that was indicative of people who were probably coming as indentured laborers. This cemetery is divided across religious lines. So above that, you'll see Christian. And it's very, very, very faint, but you'll see plague written in some of these quadrants. So these individuals were buried almost without question directly as a consequence of these malaria epidemics. The division indicates to us that it was probably people of the the indentured laboring classes that were buried in these locations. Although as we're undertaking the archaeological work, some complexity is being underscored there as well in terms of who was being buried specifically. So we are starting to reveal the tangible context through both, of course, the osteological work. So that's really a main focus of this work. We're looking at the actual human remains themselves, and we're undertaking both the traditional morphological processes to identify whether we've got morphological markers like cribra orbitalia that is indicative of anemia, and in some ways can be used as a proxy for looking for suggesting that malaria was also present. There are other proteomics and of course a huge, very strong dedication to both demographic and pathogen DNA. So we're effectively looking at whole genome sequences for demographic contextualization. Where are these populations coming from? How do they interact when they actually arrive on Mauritius? And who's making up this very large burial context? We estimate of at least 700 individuals. And to that, so this is just a slight tangent, we're undertaking a large swathe of climatic data gathering, shall we say, including from coral. Coral is an absolutely brilliant ecological proxy data set where within these bands, similar to tree rings, we're capturing evidence of sea surface temperature change. We're capturing evidence of fertilizer use, for example. So we're seeing the influence of agriculture and land change uses over a period of time. This is being overlaid with other archaeological techniques looking at sediment cores and so on. So I won't spend too much time on that, but I do want to emphasize the incredibly rich archival data sets that form the real basis for this particular talk and form the basis for the work that I want to emphasize and just sort of elaborate on here. These archives, we have over 100 archives dating back. So if it wasn't serendipitous enough that we are working on the specific cemetery with the human remains from this malaria epidemic, we also have over 100 archives dating back to around 1868, all of which tend to record some of this really precise and informative knowledge, informative information about the individual. So we've of course got the square number and row. I'll just come back here. You can see the organizational structure. This is the British period. And the site itself is extremely well organized and subdivided. And we can have information about the individual down to the specific row and square number within the cemetery itself. But other information that's really critical is point of origin, age, the occupation of the individual. In many cases, the cause and place of death are recorded as well as the date as well. So this is an incredibly important archive for us. We were funded by the British Library and in collaboration with our colleagues at the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Arts and Culture in Mauritius, who sort of jointly managed the cemetery and these archives. We were able to digitize this entire archive. And that's actually on the British Library website now as one of their endangered archives. They've got a platform there which you can access the information, access the images and so on, and access the databases, the archive itself. And effectively what we've done is to move that forward and try to find ways to extract the really rich evidence that we can use, not just within the context of our integration. So you can see we've got archaeogenetic, we've of course got historical, but also climate evidence, not just within this context, but more specifically try to understand at a very deep level, what were the circumstances for laboring peoples during this time when presenting with an epidemic disease. I just want to tangent here for a second and use this slide to respond to Grant's second question about affordances and challenges involved in this approach. Well, our team, as you can see, the challenges for us are dealing with, and it's something that we almost invariably have a sense when we're speaking to our ecology and climate colleagues. Whoops, why is my thing doing that? When we're speaking to our colleagues in other fields, their sense of our data sets is that they're fragmentary. particularly over the longer time depths, which is one of the main challenges that we have. But ultimately, we can overcome those challenges by doing what we're doing in this project, basically taking an applied approach and triangulating and aligning numerous sources of evidence. Our data sets also, so in response to the challenge is some of the affordances. Our data sets are in fact incredibly rich, very, very large. As Rose was sort of alluding to, the size of these data sets is actually extensive. When we're within the broader project, so Mauritius is one of a number of case studies that we pulled together into this project. We have over 2,500 skeletons that we will be using to assess the demographic and disease context. We're also looking at human, parasite, and vector DNA, as well as the kind of archival and climate records that you're seeing here, some of which, as I mentioned to you, are being pulled from coral cores. So there's huge data sets that help us deal with this challenge of having kind of inherently fragmentary data platform that we're working from. Now we've got, this is the published article that I'm signaling to here is work already in the don't know why that's moving forward on its own, work that's already published and gives you, this is the framework, although it's applied to another disease context. But what we're doing is using these data sets in new ways. And what I want to sort of mention when we're talking about our integration of climate and historical climate evidence, our coral cores are accurate to about the monthly scale, which as you can see here is exactly the same scale that we have from our climate records coming from historical archives. That's really the first time that anyone studying malaria within this, whether historical or even contemporary context, has been able to align evidence from agriculture, shall we say, as we could take from coral cores, with historical climate evidence. It's a really unique synthesis of disparate data sets that outside of an archaeohistoric context, we've not really been able to do. So this is something that's being done for the first time. And it will effectively allow us to concretely link mortality and land use. And again, this is something that's not been done within the context of malaria studies today, to our knowledge. But just kind of wrapping up, I'm conscious of time, but bringing this to a conclusion, what we have are really massive data sets. And this responds to Grant's last question, is how do you characterize your use of databases? Well, we don't really use databases, not in the conventional sense. And I think databases as such are somewhat limiting to the type of work that we do. We have massive, really complex, interdependent data sets. And the way of summarizing this is that in the same way that Google uses your search history to train its algorithms, we're literally using history as well as the climatic, archaeological, and genomic records and data to train our algorithms, our neural networks, to seek patterns between outbreaks, mortality, vectors, climate, and human activity. This is a really unique, effectively an entirely unique application of data science. And just to wrap up, we've literally recently come up, one of our team, Sadvik, an intern on our project, who's just a fantastic data scientist, who's pulled together some evidence that we've been working with libraries through Claudia, Engel, and colleagues, and our students who have been funded by VPUE, who have digitized using Transcribus and other platforms, who have digitized these archives and made them available to the AI platform for our neural networks. And from these archives already, what we've seen is results that we wouldn't have ever anticipated. If you are, amongst other results that we're looking at now in relation to sex, gender of individuals, also age, structures, and so on. One of the key characteristics that we seem to have found now is that when you interpolate these data sets, if you present with malaria and you end up in hospital, you're more likely to die than if you'd stayed at home. And that is really a remarkable conclusion from this preliminary research. That's a really remarkable conclusion because it literally overturns what we might have anticipated looking into the past, that actually going to hospital would have been useful, would have been a way to support your health. That doesn't seem to be the case within the data sets that we're looking at. And when we dig deeper into the history, what is clear is that the huge psychological and physiological stress combined with malaria particularly impacting the people who are coming through the indentured diaspora, debilitated their health to an extent that meant when they presented at hospital, they were more likely to die. And we've seen that in our results now. Part of the reason for that is that the difference between indenture and enslavement is that during the period of indenture, a small wage was given. If you took a day off for being sick, you lost your day's pay, you adopt a day's pay. So on such a low wage, people were really reluctant to take the time off. By the time they present with the disease, they're more likely to die. And we're actually seeing exactly this case come up from our burial archive. And those are really exciting results for us. That really helps us deepen our understanding of the indentured and laboring context at the time. We hope to add the complexity with other groups, particularly enslaved people. And hopefully in the future, this can help us to kind of generate policy that is useful for contemporary population, whether it's to do with climate or more specifically to do with dealing with disease. I'll wrap up there and leave my acknowledgement page up for a few seconds because there's many people for me to thank. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Krish. Really exciting. Please, everyone, we can open the Q&A now. If you'd like to ask your question, you can raise your hand or you can write down your question in the chat and we can read it for you. I would like to thank again Professor Boswell and Professor Seetah to present their projects today. We have still 5 minutes. Yes, Grant?
Thank you both very much for fascinating talks. I had a question for Professor Boswell on the use of photography, because clearly photography is can be a certain tool for archival purposes. Yeah. But you've also spoken very interestingly about its limitations, and then it's not merely an archival instrument, of course, but also a means of disseminating. So, given that there are different roles, could you reflect a little bit about its particular possibilities in relation to intangible heritage? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Stefania, how do you want to proceed? Do you want to take several questions and then we answer, or because I'm just mindful of time?
Yeah, exactly. We have a few minutes, so you can go ahead and answer for now, and we wait for other.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Grant. So in terms of the film and photography, so we use it as a tool, first of all, especially film, because it allows us to go back to footage and see what we might have missed in terms of particular inflections in the voices of the people that we're interviewing, to look at, limited way, I suppose, to look at body, body positioning and so on, to see whether that, in terms of how people were responding to some of the questions that were being asked. Because when the interviews take place, you can't always see that because you're in the moment with the interviewee. So we use it as almost like a research tool. And then the data is also further edited, whether it becomes part of a clip in a film documentary on marine protected areas and their impacts on local communities, or we select the data. We say, okay, well, we're not going to use it for anything beyond the research tool, focus on the photography, and then potentially use that in exhibition format. So one of the things that we are planning to do, and which some other colleagues in our international team have already done, is to have a digital sort of online kind of exhibition. So people from all over the world can engage with this material and see if there are any resonances for them in terms of their own research work that they're doing on issues of heritage. In terms of intangible, the impact on intangible cultural heritage, I think the images that we've taken for the healer diviners, I think is quite useful. So we try and maintain a little bit of anonymity, not to show the full face of the individual, but at the same time to share in some elements of the practices of the healer diviner, and to see whether that has any resonances for communities, beyond the South African context. There's always a little bit of concern there because, the extent to which you actually film, the extent to which you photograph something that might be of ritual significance, that might be perceived as something that is, ethically, a little bit problematic. So we try to, manage that divide between what is acceptable in the research context and also what may be only for our personal use for research analysis purposes.
Thank you very much.
I know that if in 1 minute because he has other commitment, and I believe also Graham Parker. So if you have just the last question, otherwise we can end it up here.
There's a question from Carla.
Carla?
Wait, was that a question you wanted to direct?
Oh, hello. No, I was just wanted to say that the complexity of the way in which we can deal with history in the Indian Ocean. So it was very, very helpful to see, all the things we can, like grab from both presentations. So it was just that remark.
I was wondering if there's any circumstance in which the visual element, in the case of intangible heritage, might distract, and so if audio archives, for example, might be a valuable source that is able to generate other ways of knowing, other ways of commemorating and preserving.
Yeah, so absolutely, Grant. I mean, I think that, attending any particular sort of healer diviner session, for example, it has an oral quality to it in that, and that can't necessarily be sort of transmitted or transcribed into sort of a paperized form. So it's really useful. I just think, given the sensory work, I also think that even in terms of, I don't know how that will be done, but even in terms of scent, I think that would be really useful. So one of the things that we proposed way back in 2008 was the idea of a scented heritage route, in the same way that you have the spice route and so on, to have a scented heritage route in the Indian Ocean region. It would be fantastic to see how you could, use big data to assist that process, putting down pins or markers, to show where, there are sites of significance or practices of significance in relation to that. But yes, I think an oral archive would be useful, considering ICH. Voice work, we always talk about voice work, the songs, the singing practices, for example, in the Indian Ocean region, whether it's in Mauritius or Madagascar, are actually quite unique. And it will be useful to have that as an alternative source of information. Yeah.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I believe that the time is up for today. If there is no really last question quickly, I think we can close here. It's okay for you, Parker, Professor Parker? Mm-hmm. I want to say, please. I want to thank you again, Professor Boswell and Professor Sita, for presenting in this workshop. It's a very inspiriting to listen and learn from your projects. Also, I want to thank all of you for your participation. We look forward to see you in 2 weeks on March 10th with Professor Johan Furi of Stellenbosch University. Thank you again and have a lovely day or evening or afternoon.
Thanks, Stefania. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you again.